What I want to talk about today is whether Star Wars is dystopian fiction. I think that there are two ways of looking at this. Number one is, does it take place in a dystopian society? Which the answer is absolutely yes, and we will get more into why that is the case. Number two is, does it follow the conventions of dystopian fiction and explore the kinds of questions that dystopian fiction typically does? And the answer is occasionally, but not really. So that's the short answer. But stay tuned because we're going to dig deeper into what I mean by both of those things. Why is the Star Wars galaxy dystopian? I think that's fairly self-evident. You've got the Galactic Empire who, rules with an iron fist and blows up peaceful planets just on a whim to show its power, and you have planets like Tatooine, for instance, or I can't remember the name of it, but the one where Han Solo grew up, that are just completely bleak and unpleasant. You do have some nice places in the galaxy. Naboo seemed like a nice place, but overall the Star Wars galaxy is not a fun place to live. It's also a world where there are robots that have human-level intelligence and personalities and memories and clearly seem to experience emotions, and yet basically are treated like disposable machines and can be bought and sold and memory wiped and disassembled for spare parts and whatever the case may be, with, having no say in it whatsoever. That's pretty grim and dystopian. The whole concept of the Stormtroopers in the sequel era, my goodness, that is dystopian. The idea of, children being taken away from their families and brainwashed their whole lives and then sent into battle and told to shoot civilians and stuff like that. Wow, that's a dystopian idea. So as far as a dystopia being a place usually ruled by a corrupt or oppressive government where you really would not want to live, the Star Wars galaxy absolutely qualifies. Definitely during the original trilogy, and I would say to some extent also during the prequels and the sequels. On the other hand, though, the other aspect of whether it's dystopian is whether it follows dystopian genre conventions and whether the story itself explores the same kind of questions and goes down the same kind of pathways as your typical dystopian story. And that's really not the case for Star Wars. Dystopian novels usually follow a character who is within this system and just takes it for granted that this is the way that it is, but slowly starts to question things and starts to push back and rebel. And you do get the rebellion in Star Wars, but there's never really any questioning of the way that things are. It's more like just an action-adventure story that's set in a dystopian world. You do get that on some level in a couple of specific places. Like, for instance, when Finn realizes that he doesn't want to be a stormtrooper and he rescues Poe and then finds himself on this desert planet with really no clue what he's doing, trying to get the droid back to the Resistance. That feels very traditionally dystopian to me because just a few minutes ago he was part of this messed up system and now he's fighting against it. But with Luke Skywalker, for instance, there's not really that same kind of dynamic going on. It's not that he's breaking free of brainwashing or anything like that. Dystopian novels also typically are interested in questions about society and how it should or shouldn't be structured and governed and whatnot. They're basically social science fiction. And Star Wars isn't really science fiction at all. It's more fantasy in an outer space setting. Yes, it has the spaceships and the robots and everything, but also it has the Force, which is very similar to a magic system in a fantasy world. It has characters like Luke Skywalker, who's essentially a chosen one fantasy hero. Obi-Wan Kenobi, who's the traditional fantasy mentor figure. He's the wise old Jedi, but basically the wise old wizard. You're rescuing princesses, you're fighting bad guys that call themselves Emperor or whatever. So the storyline that it follows is very much one that's typical of the fantasy genre, even though it's set in a science fiction setting. Unlike, for example, Star Trek, which is also not dystopian, but sometimes some of the planets that they visit do include dystopian societies, or sometimes the questions that are explored are similar to ones that would come up in a dystopian novel, like the episode The Measure of a Man comes to mind. Star Wars really doesn't dwell on those social science type questions. It's more concerned with the adventure. So it's just, completely different genre expectations, completely different themes being explored. And I'm not saying that any of that makes it, not a good story or whatever. It's just a completely different genre in terms of everything except for the setting. Occasionally it kind of wanders in the direction of dystopia, but usually it doesn't go headfirst into it because ultimately the point of Star Wars is still the adventure and the battles and the characters and sometimes the romance. And the stories are more of an action adventure, fantasy and space kind of story, as opposed to the social science, science fiction, how should society be or not be kind of questions that drive dystopian fiction.